What's up, Impact students? I wanted to start out tonight by telling you the most embarrassing story of my life. The year was 2005. I was a freshman in high school at Alexander High School in Douglasville, Georgia. I was playing baseball for the freshman team there. We were the Alexander Cougars, and we were playing our county rival, the Douglas County Tigers. And the game was taking place at Hunter Park in Douglasville, Georgia. I was very familiar with Hunter Park. Hunter Park was where I played all my games as a little leaguer. And in this specific game, I was riding the Pine Pony. For those of you that aren't familiar with sports, that's also known as the bench. And in this particular game, we were trailing the entire game until about the 6th inning. And that's when we started to make a comeback. And that's when I heard my coach yell, "Hughes, grab a bat." So I grabbed a bat and headed out to the hole, and then made it, which is where you are before you go out into the on-deck circle. And we started to make a comeback. And the guys that were in front of me got on base. And so when I came up to the plate, there were runners on first and second with no one out. And so I get ready to step into the box. I take my signs from the third base coach. He gives me the sacrifice bunt sign. And that means you are basically going to give yourself up to advance the runners. And so they wanted me to give myself up to advance the runners to second and third. So the first pitch that comes my way, I drop a sacrifice bunt down the first base line. And not only do the runners get to second and third, but I get on first base as well. So everybody's going crazy. We were once down 3 or 4 runs. Now we're only down 1 run, and it is 6-5. And we have the bases loaded with no one out. So we are in prime position to not only tie, but also to take the lead. And this is where the story gets a little blurry for me and gets pretty crazy. All I can remember is taking my lead from the first base, and I remember looking to second, and perhaps maybe the second baseman was playing in because the bases were loaded. So I don't remember seeing my teammate on second base that I had just advanced. And so the very next pitch, the pitcher throws the pitch to the catcher. The catcher, it was some sort of a pass ball. He fumbles it, and I instinctively take off to second. Because in Little League, generally, if there was nobody on second and there was a pass ball, it was just assumed that you would take the base. And so I instinctively just take off. And I'm about halfway to second base, and I realize, hey, they're not throwing the ball down. I got this base stolen easily. And then I get to second base, and I realize what I had just done. I had just tried to steal second base with the bases loaded. For those of you that aren't familiar with sports or baseball, you can't steal second base with the bases loaded. You can steal home with the bases loaded, but not second base. And so ultimately, I end up being tagged out, and we end up losing the game 6-5 as a result of my just mental error. And we were in a prime position to score, to tie and take the lead, and ultimately I ruined that opportunity for our team. And so here's the illustration, the spiritual illustration, the spiritual point to this story. What if during middle and high school we really feel like we're stealing second base? We really feel like we're following Jesus. We're doing what He's calling us to do. However, what if at the end of middle and high school we find out that all we were really doing was stealing second base with the bases loaded? In other words, we weren't following Jesus. We weren't actually stealing second base. We were trying to steal second base with the bases loaded. And so tonight, I want to talk about what it looks like for you as a middle and high schooler to steal second base, to follow Jesus. Because at the end of middle, at the end of high school, at the end of college, at the end of every single milestone of our lives, we want to be following Jesus. We want to be stealing second base. We don't want to be stealing second base with the bases loaded, because that ends up in destruction and despair and just not a good situation. And so tonight we're going to talk about that, what it looks like for you to follow Jesus personally. And we need to remember this: Jesus always determines and defines what it means to follow him. If we're going to follow Jesus, it would make sense that we are going to go to him to find out what it means to follow him. There's a lot of people in this world that have an opinion of what it means to follow Jesus. I'm sure you and I have constructed our own opinions. Perhaps your parents have constructed an opinion. Perhaps your school teachers or your friends. We know the culture tries to instruct us in what and how they think we should follow Jesus. But ultimately, if we're going to follow him, we got to go to the ultimate source, and that's Jesus himself. So tonight, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 9, and we're going to be focusing on verses 23 and 24. So I would just encourage you right now to turn there with me. I'll give you a chance to get there. And let's read. Verse 23, it says this: "And he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it." There's 3 principles that deal directly to you as a middle and high school student if you have a desire to follow Jesus. And the first one is this: following Jesus is not about you. Look back at verse 23. It says this: "And he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself." The text doesn't say this, but it's implied. He's talking to both men and women. Anybody that wants to be a follower of him, they must deny him or herself. And so what is Jesus talking about when he says a person must deny him or herself? Is he talking about just denying yourself of personal preferences, such as your favorite food or your favorite drink? Is he talking about denying yourself of your favorite TV show or favorite kind of music? I don't think so. Not in this situation, not in this specific passage. I believe Jesus is he's talking about something that's much deeper. And he's talking about denying yourself of personal control of your life. Because when we deny ourselves of personal control of our lives, we desire to hold on to our lives as human beings and as fallen creatures. When we give our lives over to Jesus on a moment-by-moment basis, he begins to change us from the inside out. And so he begins to impact those little situations and little preferences I was talking about earlier. But he doesn't necessarily want us to just give those straight to him. He wants us to give all of ourselves to him, because when we do that, he's going to get those little things as well. But that's not the message that our world sends us, is it? Our world tells us, hey Matt, it's all about you. We get that in culture, we get that in school, oftentimes we get that in the media, we get that from our friends. And so, how do we really apply this specific principle to our lives? Of denying ourselves, of saying, Jesus, it's not about me. Today is not about me, but it's all about you. Because there's going to be times in high school and middle school when you're recognized. Recognition is a huge thing, and it's not a bad thing. But there's 2 ways to deal with recognition. There's one way to say, when you're recognized for good grades, or whatever it is, to say, yeah, it is all about me. But as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, when we're recognized, when we're given the opportunity to speak and to give a testimony, it should really be us describing Jesus and how it's all about him and all about his glory and all about him working in and through us. And that's the only reason why we're being honored for whatever award. And so it really does impact us as middle and high school students on a daily basis. Because we're told this world is all about us. But if we're going to follow Jesus, we have to realize that he desires for us to deny ourselves. To deny ourselves and to say, Jesus, it's all about you. It's all about you living in and through me. In order to follow Jesus, we have to be willing to give up personal control because it's all about him. That's point number one. Point number two is following Jesus means daily dying. Look back at the passage. It says this: let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. We often glamorize crosses in our culture. We wear them as jewelry, as necklaces, as bracelets, and we also wear them on t-shirts. But to really understand what Jesus was saying when he said, to follow me, you must pick up your cross, we really have to place ourselves back into the first century. And for them, they understood that a cross was an element of torture. These followers, these people that were following Jesus had seen the Romans, the political system of the time, put people on crosses because they were enemies of the state or they were criminals. So for them, it was a real thing. Jesus was saying, if you want to follow me, you have to daily pick up your cross. You have to daily be willing to not only die to yourself spiritually, but you have to be daily willing to die physically if you're going to follow me. Now for us, we, a lot of times in this 21st century American culture, we don't really have to be worried about dying physically for Jesus. It could happen if you go on a mission trip, or it could happen in America somewhere sometime. But ultimately, if we're going to follow Jesus, we have to be willing to die to self. We have to be willing to die to self. And Jesus says that right here, and the Apostle Paul will later elaborate on that in Galatians 2:20. He says this: I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live in this body. I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So how does this practically impact your life on a daily basis? Of dying to self and saying yes to Jesus and allowing him to live in and through you. Well, let me ask you this. What if your prayer every day when you get out of bed, instead of turning over and looking at your cell phone to see who left you a message during the night, or instead of getting on Facebook, what if your first thing in the morning was to say, Lord Jesus, today I desire to die to self so that you might live in and through me? Do you think your life would look any different? I would imagine your life would look a whole lot different. I would imagine as you were going to school that morning, you would be looking through a completely different lens. And the lens would not be yourself, but it would be a lens of Jesus living in and through you. And so when you were sitting in the lunchroom that day, and you were hanging out with your friends, having a great time, just fellowship and eating, and you saw that student sitting there in the corner, alone, if you were living a Galatians 2:20 life, dying to self and saying yes to Jesus, you would be obedient to the Holy Spirit and go spend some time with that student and encourage them. Or perhaps you as a follower of Jesus, you haven't been living the Galatians 2:20 life. You haven't been obedient to him. But today was different. Today you were saying yes to Jesus and no to self. And today you were going to share your faith with that student that you know is lost and dying and just not experiencing the abundant life that Christ has to offer. Because you were going to die to self and say yes to Jesus. So it does impact us on a daily basis. Jesus desires for us to live the Galatians 2:20 life of saying no to self and yes to him. So following Jesus means daily dying. And then finally, I want us to look at the third point. Following Jesus means losing your life. Look at verse 24.